At exactly 19 minutes to 5, Power Up on Power 98.7. Now we are talking. Let's move on to this conversation with the author of Blaming on Apartheid and political analyst Thami Malinga, who joins us now as we talk about how funding dynamics influence the operations and public perception of non-profit organizations, particularly those engaged in advocacy and litigation. Now, in recent years, we've witnessed how funding or lack thereof, for that matter, can influence not only the operations of non-profits, but also their public perception. One organization that has been in the center of this conversation is the Hellen Suzman Foundation, known for its advocacy in human rights and democratic values. The foundation has come under increasing scrutiny, especially with a petition recently circulating calling for it to cease operations. But what's behind this shift in public sentiment? Is it simply a reaction to the foundation's advocacy work, or are the funding dynamics playing a larger role in shaping how the public views this organization and others for that matter? We speak to Thami Malinga on how these dynamics of funding influence the operations and public perception of these NPOs, particularly those that are engaged in advocacy and litigation. Thami, good morning.
Good morning, Gwena. Good morning, and good morning to the 3am cult and everyone who's listening to Power Up everywhere around the globe.
Thank you so much for always making time. And I mean, when it comes to the issue of NPOs, and particularly the example that we're using there in the Hellen Suzman Foundation, it has come under fire for its beliefs and some of its challenges that it has had. But how much of funding or lack thereof, again, plays a role in making sure that advocacy groups like this, I guess, continue pushing their agenda, as it were?
Funding plays a very crucial role, Gwena, in terms of what these groups do. Funding is the one that determines their existence, and to a larger extent, again, funding will determine their agenda. Gwena, I'll take you back to the 70s. In terms of what funding can do to an organization. There was an organization called for Congress for Cultural Freedom. It operated here in South Africa and to a larger extent, to some other parts in Africa, other countries in Africa. This organization, it served because at that point in time, what happened is the liberation movements or to an extent cultural organizations in South Africa, they started using the arts and culture as a form of expression and as a form of resistance against apartheid. So most people started using that platform.
That's when the rise of protest theater and other things. Yeah.
Yes. And the likes of CIA, they set up that organization, and people like Eskiya Mphahlele, the great Eskiya Mphahlele, the author, they found themselves getting scholarships to study in the USA. That's how Eskiya Mphahlele found himself studying in the USA. I think Liplok Mudisane found himself when he was in exile, though, working somewhere in Africa. But he had left South Africa, then went overseas, and then he found himself working with some cultural groups in Kenya around that time. But he then found himself getting funding. But it was through this organization. They found out later that this organization was actually a CIA organization. And I think Eskiya Mphahlele at some point in time, he ended up admitting to say, listen, we were founded by this organization, but we didn't know. Yeah, Eskiya was not ashamed then to admit that, yeah, we were funded, but we didn't know that it was a CIA organization. So that's why I'm saying that this is what happens with NGOs. This is what money does, and sometimes it determines the course of NGOs. Sometimes it determines the shape and form of NGOs.
Do then these funders And again, I guess you can use the same example in politics, where funders would then knowingly put their money there to shape the narrative, to put an agenda, to say, if we give you this money, then this is the agenda that we want you to push. This is the narrative that we want you to push.
To a large extent, when that definitely will happen. One would ask you. You could ask the same question in terms of political party funding. What happens when funders fund political parties? Do they just throw in money there to say, okay, guys, we give you this money, but just to help you because you're a political party? What is it in? What is it? What's the return on investment for them? Do they just give it for free and stay back? So that the same applies with the NGOs. Yes, they are NGOs, but these are NGOs that call themselves advocacy groups. So these funders would then put in money there, but at the point in time, they would also, to a large extent, go in to also influence the board of trustees appointments. They would also go in to also influence how these organizations, through the board of trustees appointees, they would go in to a large extent influence in terms of what's the course of direction that these NGOs must take. I'll give you just a couple of examples that I've come to look at here in South Africa, and there's the tentacles of one very popular family is prevalent in most NGOs. One might say, yeah, but they've got generational wealth. They're supposed to give, But one would say, yeah, but I would question being with Thami and say, yeah, but they've got their tentacles in all these organizations, like your Brandhurst, what's this Brandhurst group that does, it calls itself a body that facilitates policy and strategies about Africa. It's also there in the Hellen Suzman Foundation, and then you would ask yourself, why are they there in all these foundations? What's the purpose? Why are they funding all these? Is it part of the family's generational strategy to control Africa and because they've been mining in Africa for generations and generations. So yeah, one would ask you need to ask yourself that what's their funding strategy? Is it generational in terms of making sure that through these trusts, through these NGOs, these advocacy groups, they need to control the narrative and everything about Africa.
So with that said, I mean, again, bringing in the issue of politics, political parties, we have seen, again, to name these families and how they've influenced or at least put their money in different political parties, where we've seen different political parties being funded by the same person or the same family, which again raises that question as to what would be the objective in that regard. If you're giving money to Rise Mzansi and then to Action SA and to the DA, which are parties that one can argue that they have got the different policies and values, yet you've got this one family, and I'm using that as an example, donating to that. Is it again pushing a certain policy or narrative, or trying to get control irrespective of where the voters might go?
It's a control irrespective of where the voters go. It's making sure that whoever comes in will have to, at the end of the day, come back and listen to you. Even if the voters, it is what we are seeing now. Even if when the voters are split, you are able to come in and rein them in. When you've heard about heading the cats. No one can head the cats. But in this instance, through this strategy, you are able now to head the cats and making sure that everyone comes in and march to the same drumbeat. So it's basically a very, very good strategy and to make sure that now everyone comes in and now is able to march through to the same drumbeat. It's a Pied Piper type of a scenario. The piper now is playing the tune. All the reds are now following the piper because they are now hypnotized to the rhythm of the piper because the piper is now playing the tune. So that is a very well thought of strategy.
Mm.
Yes.
So now back to our point, Thami, the dynamics now and how they influence operations and particularly public perception of this non-profit organization. Again, using the Hellen Suzman Foundation as an example, that does that also push that narrative and the public perception of this NPOs? Because again, the Hellen Suzman Foundation, there's a lot of question marks as to exactly what agenda they are pushing, whether it's anti-South African or pro-foreigner and so on and so forth, depending on which side of the coin that you are.
Yeah, the Hellen Suzman Foundation, their problem lies again with the South African Constitution. I've been doing quite a lot of work in terms of trying to understand that, because I've been one person who's like, can I write something to the South African Human Rights Commissioner against these guys? Because I'm one person who also believes that they're anti-South African to an extent. Now, the South African Constitution preamble says South Africa belongs to all who live in it, united in our diversity, blah, 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 all of that. Now, and then I said, these guys are, that is the HSF. So these guys are always, litigating against the government of South Africa. And I was incensed at the time when there was that ZEP litigation, because they part of their mandate is also litigation. And then when I looked at that, and I was like, okay, but yeah, the South African Constitution as well says that South Africa belongs to all who live in it. So the Hellen Suzman Foundation, is good, is within its rights to take the South African government to court, because the Constitution says South Africa belongs to all who live in it. So when you read in terms of their missions and all of that, they say that they are non-partisan. They are promoting liberal democratic values. They will, and they quote succinctly specific parts of our Constitution, and they've been very good with it. They say that our Constitution and they will use those codes as a society based on democratic values, social justice, and fundamental human rights, which is part of that preamble. Free the potential of each person. Every citizen is equally protected by the law, and that is part of the Hellen Suzman mission.
Just finally, then, Thami, when you look at it, how should we then, as the public, read this? How should we react to such? Particularly because we agree that those that fund these NPOs, those that fund, and we can throw in political parties, they want to push a certain narrative. Can we then say that those that have deeper pockets can influence policy and how we perceive things?
That 100% is clear, Gwena. Those that fund these institutions will influence what these institutions do. That I will tell you. Iqiniso elingenakuphikiswa ngesizulu. Yes, that I will tell you. Those that fund these institutions will influence what these institutions do. When just shortly, in my book, I write about this. When I write about self-hate, when we say that South Africans are Afrophobic or xenophobic, I say who then employs people that comes across the borders? Who fights for people that comes across the borders to take these positions? The answer to that will tell you.
Absolutely. Thami?
Yeah.
We're going to have to leave it there, but as always, thank you so much for always making time to speak to us. Appreciate your time and your insight. Where do people find you? Where do people find your work and otherwise?
You'll find me at Thami25 on Twitter, Thami Malinga on all the platforms, whether it's Facebook, whether it's LinkedIn, whether it's Instagram. You will find me here at hashtag #PowerUp every day, 3 to 6. We're having discussions on the X platform at Power 987. You will find my books at Exclusive Books. You'll find my books at Book Circle Capital. Those are the places where you'll always find me.
Fantastic. Thami D. Malinga, thank you always for making time to speak to us, political analyst and author of Blame Me on Apartheid, and a card-carrying member, a member in good standing of the Power Up cult.